Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Remember to subscribe to our free podcast so you won't miss any of our illuminating content. Here is episode 170.
And so, being able to kind of step out of that traditional mindset and just realize, learning doesn't have to look like school. They're two separate things.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Joel Hammon. Joel is the author of the Teacher Liberation Handbook and is co-founder of the Learning Cooperatives, a group of self-directed learning centers in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He is also the co-founder of the Liberated Learners, an organization dedicated to helping educators create and sustain self-directed learning centers around the world. Joel was a social studies teacher for 11 years in the traditional public and private schools. He lives with his family in Langhorne, Pennsylvania, and can be reached at me@joelhammond.com. Welcome, Joel.
Hi, thank you, Rebecca.
Great. After reading Joel's book entitled The Teacher's Liberation Handbook, it has a subtitle of How to Leave School and Create a Place Where You and Young People Can Thrive. I'm so excited to have this illuminating conversation about freeing teachers and students. But before we get into all of that, can you please tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. From a little small farm town in Ohio called Napoleon, and I grew up. My father was a teacher, and growing up, I had always thought that a teaching career was what I wanted to do, and so I grew up doing normal stuff. I was on the basketball team. I did a lot of school-related stuff. I went to a traditional school. So, I went to college for secondary education. I wanted to be a social studies teacher, which I did. And I ended up teaching for a year back in Ohio right after college, and then eventually moved out to the East Coast here and started teaching in schools out here.
Great. Well, and I kind of wanted to read a little bit of the preface of the book, of Joel's book, of different questions, and then we'll move into what his educational journey looked like that led him to discover what he's doing now. But he says, "Are you a teacher? Do you love working with kids but are frustrated by a system in which you work? Do you wish that there was a way to work with young people in a meaningful and purposeful way that would allow you to bring your own creativity and passions to the job without having to deal with all the regulations handed down from the department, district, state, and federal government?" I just love those questions because, I love asking questions on my podcast, but I think those kind of really put a lean on what your thought process might have been as you went through your educational journey. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, of, how that evolved to what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. I had very idealistic sort of ideas about teaching and learning, when I was younger and going through college. I had this idea that, school had always worked very well for me, when I was in high school. And so I went into teaching just assuming that was how everybody experienced school. And so I believed very, very deeply in the power of traditional education to, shape and improve young people's lives. And so that was sort of the mindset I went into the teaching profession in. And, it was very like, I don't know I think I mentioned the book, was it The Dead Poets Society, or whatever that movie was, where it's like, Robin Williams up on the desk, like, I'm going to lead you to the pinnacle of knowledge. It was this very inspirational thing. And I thought, that, students were just naturally going to come along for that ride. And what I found when I actually got my first teaching job and started working full time was just that that is not how many young people experience school. And instead of being something that was empowering and exciting and helping kids grow, what I found very often was that I was just making young people who didn't necessarily want to be there, do things they didn't want to do. And, that's certainly not why I went into teaching in the first place, and, not a very inspiring way to go through life. And so, when I started to realize this, I thought it was me at first. So I was like, all right, well, let's just do some really innovative things. So it was like, throw out the textbooks, just do as many things as we can to make it relevant to kids' lives. And, I don't want to say that it wasn't, useful. There was a number of kids that I had in my classes that I would say really liked, what we were doing, and got, I'm still in touch with them today. And they said it was, life changing, but, it was a very small number. I mean, the vast majority were just, is this on the test?
Well, and some of those students might have been like you, where the system was very, it worked well for you. And so
that's right. Yeah. And so it just, I found out pretty quickly, within the first couple of years of teaching, that just, I didn't think this was not what I had imagined. It's not what I sort of signed up for. And so, that's really what started me looking into, what else could you do? Because if you're a teacher and you don't like school, your job, I don't know. It's, what do you do? Right. And so it was really in that sort of process of like just realizing that this was not, I was not going to be able to do this for the rest of my life. I'm trying to find a different way to work with young people that was more in line with sort of that inspirational and sort of idealistic idea that I had.
Well, and I love the questions that I read, because as you read further on, those are questions that I'm sure a lot of educators ask themselves. And really, it does come down to a fact, like, if you're not happy being there either, and then you have students that aren't be happy being there, what's the point of that job? And kind of trying to move it to, like we talked about, the Dead Poets Society, where you have, children that are just budding in this, learning environment that everyone's thriving and loves it. Let's kind of go through, in chapter 1, you do a lot of comparisons between what your life was before in the public school and what it's like now with the Princeton Learning Center.
Right. So, I think that, and that's the big point. This is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is just that I think there's a lot of teachers who feel like I did, who are there on a daily basis. But, it's like the teachers that I talk to, and I have almost all my friends are teachers. My wife is a teacher in the high school that I used to teach at. So I still am very much connected to that. And, it's very few and far between the conversations I have with educators where they're like really happy to get up and go to work every day, right? And for a number of reasons, whether it's, just kind of like the whole testing craze and, the standardization of everything, to just, politics, to lack of respect from, so there's just all these things. And so, when I was teaching, to be really honest, I was pretty miserable. And, it comes back to the thing, I don't want to make it too dramatic, but, just sort of feeling like a prison guard, in a lot of ways, just watching over these people who don't want to really be there. And so, a lot of those experiences I kind of put in the book was just to contrast the huge difference of sort of, at least from my perspective, working with young people in a traditional setting, where it's very much, I have this content that we need to get through, and it's going to be standardized by the district, by textbooks, by all these curriculum, all these kind of things, to what I'm doing now with my time, which is just forming just really deep and meaningful relationships with young people based on where they're at in their life and what they want to do with themselves and what their goals, what they're good at, and it's just, I don't know. For my money, it's way better.
Yeah. Well, and one of the cool things, like when he goes through some of his contrasts in the book, he talks about like meetings that he used to have with students and how it was very, describe some of those words. Some of the things, you felt like the student had some indifference, some shame, some defiance, was rising as you're talking to them about how bad their test scores are and, what they're missing and all of those, the assignments that they're missing. And even you, as an educator, how did it make you feel?
Yeah, well, so in the book, describing, what was a very common occurrence when I taught middle school for a while, for 5.5 years, and, what's called the team meeting, right? So we had, social studies, math, the core subject teachers, the guidance counselor, usually a principal, sometimes a social worker, and, we're calling in a family whose, kid is, really struggling in a lot of those classes. And, like I described in the book, it's, it's all pretty much all the adult authority figures in this kid's life just sitting around the table staring at him like, you're not doing well. Like,
kind of shaming him in a way.
Yeah. And the purpose, and I don't want to, kind of denigrate there's a lot of really wonderful people who work in schools. And, I taught with a lot of them. And the idea of those meetings was to try to help. That from the standards of, traditional education, when someone's not getting good grades or they're struggling, or they don't care about the work, or they, just aren't doing it or acting up because they're bored or whatever it is, the problem is not perhaps with the setting and with the system that the young people find themselves in. It's the kid, right? I mean, that's where the sort of blame comes down. And so very well-meaning kind of meetings to try to like help somebody. But, the effect of it, I would have to imagine. I never was on the other side of one of those meetings, but
there's feelings in the room. I mean, there's obviously emotion going on, correct? I mean, you talked about crying and a lot of those things.
We kept tissues on the table, right? Because a lot of times, it was very emotional for the parents, for the young people. And depending on the young person, I'd say in the book, they were either feeling ashamed or, becoming, defiant, like, I don't care, what are you going to, and so it was just, and not really ever seeing it get better. Right. So I don't remember maybe one, out of all the years that I was teaching where sort of some sort of intervention like that actually, produced lasting difference. Right. Yeah. And so it was hard, and so what I contrast that with is sort of the meetings that I have with young people now. Right. So I have meetings with those exact same kinds of kids now, but instead of talking to them about, what you're missing and how bad you're doing and all these kind of things, when we have those initial meetings with young people who are struggling in school or just don't like it, the meetings are very different, right? I get to be the person who probably the only adult ever in this young person's life who has told them that, all that stuff you're dealing with, you can leave it behind, right? That there is a way to live and learn that does not include school, right? And if you don't want to, set foot in a middle school or a high school ever again, you don't have to, unless you want to. And the option to learn independently in that way is available to you right now. And all of the things that you could ever want in your life, including going to college, including any kind of profession that you want, is still open to you. And you don't need to attend middle and high school unless you want to. Right? If that's what you want for yourself, fine. But I get to be the person to tell you that there's another way. It's such a rewarding thing. And sometimes it's just the body language. Kids will come in and, they don't really understand what we're doing. For them, it's just, the parents maybe are dragging them to another school meeting or whatever. They start all slumped over and kind of, whatever. But
don't really care type of attitude. Yeah.
Just like, really, what are you going to tell me? Right. And, and by the end of it, just sitting up, smiling, maybe for the first time in a long time, right? Yeah. And so we keep tissues on the table too, because, when we invite a kid to stay for the day and, you want to check this place out, and they're like, yeah, I do. Sometimes it's the first thing they've said yes to in a really long time. It might be the first time the parents have seen them smile in a long time. And then sometimes, parents can get emotional about that, right? And so it's just a much different way of working and supporting with young people, supporting young people, for me anyway. I mean, it's just, it's very rewarding and certainly, better experience for me than when I was in traditional schools.
Yeah. Some of the emotions that I wrote down as I was reading it, it's really a feeling of hopelessness, anger, and shaming versus maybe hope, finally feeling like somebody's helping you and cares about you, and that there's somebody that has faith in you too. I mean, those were some of the differences that I got from some of the stories that I read in it. But, and I think, with this contrast, how do you feel like your paradigm or your educational philosophy has changed over time and with experience?
A lot, probably. I grew up, in my early career, I didn't question, sort of the traditional model of education, right? I mean, it worked for me when I was growing up. My dad was a teacher, my mom was a secretary in school. That's all I knew. So it wasn't really until I started teaching in a traditional setting where I just was confronted with the daily reality of it not working for a lot of kids. And so, I found out eventually, which maybe we'll talk about later, found out about this place called North Star up in Massachusetts, which came with this idea of self-directed learning and using homeschooling to sort of leave the system and create the kind of life you want for yourself. And so for me, that was just like a total mind-blowing kind of thing, and I didn't really believe it at first, right? So I had to, I was looking into it quite a bit, and I was just inspired by it. And even like when we were building, the Princeton Learning Cooperative, which is the first center we built, there was still like a pretty big deschooling. Like a lot of times we think of young people having to deschool when they leave the system and just kind of figure things out. There's a big process for me too.
I really think the challenge comes to the people that have been in the system. I mean, I've had a difficult time with it too. So yeah. Yeah.
I mean, just the idea, when I was a teacher, you have a lot of authority, I guess, in some ways, or imagined authority in terms of how you deal with young people, right? So the idea that, I definitely know better than you, and it's more important what I have for us to do than what your interest might be. It's a pretty big thing. The fact that I could control people's movements down even to just like, can they go to the bathroom or not? My permission, which is, outside the context of traditional schooling, is just a really weird thing to tell a 17-year-old when you can and can't go to the bathroom. So, there was just some of those aspects of, and not, like for my friends who still teach, it's not like a conscious thing, like I'm going to be this controlling thing. It's just the nature of the system, right? Yeah. And so, having that in mind, and just even like what learning means, right? So learning to me was, all right, you have this organized curriculum. You sit there and someone delivers it to you. You're basically mostly a passive sort of recipient of it. And, it's on these important things, right? U.S. history and algebra. And, that's what counts as learning. All this other stuff, you messing around with your computers and learn how to build them and learning how to program and do cool things with video games, that doesn't count. It's not.
That's
important.
You playing. That's playing.
You playing, let's get back to the serious curriculars. But, obviously sort of stepping out of that paradigm and just realizing that, learning happens all the time, everywhere. And the most meaningful things very often in our lives that we learn, don't come from sort of formal academic settings. And so just being open to all the experiences and resources and possibilities in the community for young people was a real challenge to sort of overcome. So I remember, I think maybe I talk about it in the book at one point, very early on when I was a staff member at PLC, and everything that happens at PLC is voluntary, right? We don't make anyone do anything. We offer resources and options. Yeah. And so we're just sitting there, we were very small at that point. Maybe we had like 7 or 8 kids, and everyone's just sitting around, messing around on the computer, talking, doing whatever, nothing that would have been considered work, in school. And I remember having just like an anxiety attack. Like, what are we doing here? Like, is this really, this is it? Like, this is useful and valuable. And so, it's taken me, a long time to value a lot of things that aren't typically valued in the school. So like, for instance, like in our common room on any given day, it would just be a bunch of kids hanging out and talking and goofing around and playing on computers and watching videos or whatever together. And, the school teacher in me looks at that and goes, oh, what a waste of time. They could be, practicing, vocab quizzes for biology or something. But then when you step back and look at the big picture of what teenagers need, what young people need, what's going to be most effective and useful in their life, the ability to make friends and make social connections and, carry on a conversation with people and whatever. Like, I'm going to
articulate your ideas, correct.
Yeah. And get into arguments with people and figure out how to do that without being disrespectful. And, all that stuff that you just see happening, these kids just, what we would playing or messing around or whatever are really deep and important, kind of social skills. And so, being able to kind of step out of that traditional mindset and just realize, learning doesn't have to look like school. They're two separate things. And, sometimes learning can happen in like traditional school model, but oftentimes it doesn't. And there's lots of other ways to do it.
Well, and kind of what I came away with this book, and I think one of the things that I love so much, I mean, my audience knows I homeschool my kids. And, sometimes schooling, and it seems like such drudgery. Sometimes when I'm having to go through the curriculum and I don't know, it just seems so they're not enjoying it. I'm not enjoying it. I totally understand what you're saying. And I guess I just felt some like your book is titled, that liberation, that it really can happen, that kids will love to learn when there's not that compulsion, mechanism involved in it. And that's what I really loved about it. But why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about like your learning centers and how that evolved and what those centers look like? You kind of put it, gave us an idea just a minute ago, but let's really go into the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah. So, I guess the big just sort of organizational picture of what these things are, and then we can get into the specifics of what happens here. So the big picture is just that what we do is help families and young people utilize homeschooling law to leave the traditional school system, which by homeschooling, we don't mean, just taking school and doing it at home. We don't mean parents teaching their kids algebra at the kitchen table. Some people certainly homeschool that way and it works for them. But for us,
your learning centers are open like 4 days a week, correct? Is that
right? So it's the homeschooling is sort of the legal mechanism that allows families to take greater control over, what, when, how, where, why learning happens, right? And so that's really the sort of the guise that we're under, right? So we support families. Almost all of our members that we work with are coming from traditional public and private settings. They would never in a million years have considered homeschooling unless we existed to support them, because they just don't feel they can, take on the responsibility, whatever it is. That's really the mission, is to help kids who feel stuck or want something else than school to leave and have, a more independent sort of life and learning situation, right? Yeah. So you can just do that, as you say, with your family. That's available to everybody right now. Like everyone could just homeschool their kid tomorrow, and that would be fine. So a number of families though, like wouldn't really consider that to be an option, right? Really just take my kid out of school. That's not going to work for us, right?
Well, and you actually talk about in your book, you don't even target homeschooler. That's not the market you're trying to get, correct? You're really going for these kids that are pretty much miserable in their other setting and want something different.
Yeah. And we definitely have some longtime homeschoolers who are with us and are like some of our best members. They're just fantastic. But yeah, it's typically for kids, and a lot of our kids were doing well in school by school measures. They were getting good grades, they're showing up and all that kind of stuff, but just really, were bored to death or just didn't like what they were doing. But they were good at playing the game. Some kids come to us, in much more dire circumstances where they're just really miserable and depressed or whatever. So, right. So it's helping those kids get out and do this. And so, because a lot of families don't feel like they can maybe take this on by themselves, that's where our learning cooperatives come in, right? So what we do is provide enough support. I can talk about some of the ways that we do that. We provide enough support that it feels like an actual option for families to pull their kids out of school to do this kind of living and learning, right? And so what those actual things that we do is one, first of all, just every kid that comes here has a staff mentor. We have 3 full-time staff mentors here at Princeton Learning Cooperative. So all the members have one of those staff members as a mentor. And so we meet with each kid individually each week for, usually half an hour. And sometimes that mentoring initially can just be getting things set up. So, for kids leaving high school and it's like, all right, well, you're not going to be in school 7 hours a day. What do you want to do with your time? What are you interested in? What kind of things? Where do you see yourself going? And then helping them connect either to stuff going on here at PLC, or maybe it's resources in the community or online stuff. Whatever it is that's going to help them look into and learn about the things that they're interested in doing. Yeah. So and
like you talked about like setting up for the kid to go out to, what was it, a metalsmithing type of, I don't know what they call those, but I thought that was pretty intriguing. I mean finding those really unique opportunities, correct?
Right. So so that's part of that mentoring and just like helping kids make a life for themselves. So, that was one of the classic stories. We had somebody join a number of years ago, and we were asking them, all right, well, what are you interested in? It was like, blacksmithing, conversational Russian, what was it, ham radio? It was like these things that if I was a teacher in school and one of our my students said, "Yeah, Mr. Hammon, I'm not really feeling, U.S. history. Can we learn about, ham radio?" It's like, I get nothing for you, right? Like, I don't know, maybe you can read about it after you do your homework at night. I don't know, right? But we can, that I think goes back to the difference in relationships and just what we can do with members. We can take everyone seriously, where they are right now. We can take them seriously about what they want to do. And so, so it was, all right, let's call around. There was a blacksmith in Trenton, New Jersey, which is close by, and it was like the only blacksmith left.
He's still creating swords for the American Revolutionary War.
Still, reenactors need swords. So yes, he takes apprentices, right? So here's the phone number, call the guy, and we put out a call to our sort of network of people that we know, like anyone know conversational Russian, be willing to come in and volunteer and work with a kid a couple times a week. We had a number of people who were, emailed, Googled, Princeton ham radio. And, there was a ham radio club here in Princeton. Like, who knew? So we just emailed them like, hey, is anybody willing to come over and volunteer? And so, somebody came over and worked with him for like an hour a week to try to get his license. And so, and then, other more traditional things like, did a math class at PLC and, was into guitar and did some music stuff. But, and so this was a young person who was pretty miserable in school and really didn't like the things he was doing on a daily basis, didn't like getting out of bed. And, within a very short period of time, like all of a sudden you're involved in things that you're interested in and, it's just life's looking up. And so sometimes it can have a really dramatic effect just on, the trajectory of where kids are going.
Before we go on, let's listen to this message. Changing a paradigm takes some study, but like me, you are probably super busy. That's why we've teamed up with Audible. Go to our website, theluminousmind.net, get a free month of Audible with 2 audiobooks, thousands of titles in exchange for only books that you absolutely love. You too can be learning on the go to keep that fire burning. Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Joel Hammon, who's creating liberated learners and teachers. Do you ever see, like, when you finally, take this kid's interest of blacksmithing seriously, do you find that all of a sudden they want to do more traditional schooling? Is there a switch like that too? Or do you just find that they find opportunities to learn maybe some of those conventional things through non-conventional means?
Yeah, it's all over the place, right? It can happen in so many different ways, right? So somebody could, be doing blacksmithing and, the blacksmith's talking about the carbon content in steel or something, whatever it is, and maybe that drives an interest in chemistry. And like, what do you mean carbon in steel? How does that work?
Yeah.
And so it can go that way. And, I don't want to put it like completely away from the traditional setting. A lot of our members come in and, they didn't have academic issues with the way, content was delivered in school. It worked for them. Maybe they have a medical issue that makes it hard to go to school, or they just don't like the social atmosphere or whatever. So we have a number of kids who come and just like, just working through an algebra textbook with a tutor, taking the quizzes at the end of each section, because that works for them, And so we're just really agnostic about methods and how it looks. It's just whatever's going to work for that young person and what they want to do. And sometimes those really strong interests will drive doing other things to get where you want to go, even though you don't like it. Right. So, I would imagine, when I'm saying, we just let kids, we don't have any requirements because it's just kind of choose what they want to do. A lot of people are probably really skeptical and just like, yeah, right. Like, that's going to work. Yeah. It does. That's an unbelievable thing. And so, sometimes like, I was just actually one of our former members was here about an hour ago talking to me. He was really into film. He wants to be a filmmaker. And so, what he spent a lot of his time at PLC doing was just like making films and starting to get involved at the film program at the community college, when he was 16, 17. And one of the things that he wanted, he really struggled with math, but he knew he wanted to go to college for film. And so, he knew he had to have some math to get into college. And so, took it upon himself to do this thing that was really hard for him and that he really didn't like, because he knew it was a stepping stone in the bigger goal, right?
But
and
that's
so,
the cool part, is he's driving that now, not you, correct?
Exactly. And that is the big difference. Like, that's the context can change everything, right? So if I'm, just like, you got to do math because I'm telling you got to do math, that's kind of a recipe for disaster for a lot of kids. But, when they start to see the reason why they should do math, even if they don't love it, but they just realize they need it, a lot of times that can change, everything about how it goes. And so, our job in sort of the mentoring is just helping kids realize, and see clearly the things that might be ahead of them, and not owning them like ourselves. It's not like, you have to do math because I want you to. It's like, well, if you want to become an engineer, you may need to pay attention to some math, right? And if you don't, maybe let's revisit that goal. Maybe, do you really want to be an engineer? Like, what draws you to that? Or let's find a way that's going to work for you to learn math. Maybe it's not the traditional way. Maybe it's an online thing. Maybe it's I don't know, working through projects or whatever. So it's really just it's just much more flexible to help young people do the things they need to do, right?
Yeah. So tell me, why did you start like a self-directed learning center instead of like a charter school or, some other type of government entity that was maybe a little more lax? I mean, give us just a brief, description of why that happened.
I just don't like being told what to do very often either. So And just the red tape, right? So I've only glanced at them. I don't know if you've ever looked into the process of trying to start a charter school.
Yeah, I've done it. It's not fun.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's just this big thing. And ultimately, you have to get someone's approval for it, and, typically it's, even starting like a nice progressive private school, you're still going to be sort of in that model, and you're still going to maybe be tied to certain curricular standards or just curricular areas or ways of working with young people that might not be what that young person needs at that moment, right? And so, one, just I didn't want to have to ask permission to do what we felt was best for young people, right? I just, and everybody involved at PLC, we just wanted to, like, this is what this kid needs right now. That's what we're going to do. Because like when I was teaching, if I had a kid like, really didn't like school and he showed up in my U.S. history class, it's like, well, I don't know. Tough luck. You got to do U.S. history. You might be
it's a
going
requirement.
through,
Yeah.
It's like, I that's what I'm here for. You got to do it. Whereas, we're just much more flexible, because if a kid comes in really kind of beaten down by the educational setting they were in before and really hating whatever, math or whatever it is, forcing them to do math just because, well, you got to have a math on your schedule is not helpful in any way, right? Like, the kid's going to hate it more. They're certainly not going to learn anything, it's just going to, so, having the flexibility to really just step back and be like, all right, what is needed in this situation, and just do what's right for the young person, right? So that was a big one.
I love the third and fourth point that he gives is, that you feel better and are part of something amazing, and then the relationships are better. I think a lot of it, does it come down to the emotions and the feelings that are in that room, correct?
Right. From the type of work we do, it really feels amazing. We think we're onto something. Right, that this is going to be an important, this idea of self-directed learning and supporting young people in this way is a big deal. And we think it's going to become a bigger part of, sort of the educational conversation in America. And so, being on the forefront in some ways of that kind of work just feels amazing. It feels like you're part of the revolution, right?
Yeah.
Doing the work that's going to do it. Yeah, but then also just the way that the way that you can relate to young people. When I was teaching, it was almost, obviously we wanted kids to do well, but, very often we were on either side of a fence, right? It was like I had certain requirements that I had to do as an employee, and whether you like it or not, I have to do this, right? You have to teach this class, we're going to have to grade you, we're going to have to do all these things. And, I got along very well with a lot of my students, but there was always that kind of like cross-purpose kind of thing often, right? I was the person who could make bad things happen to them, right? I could, give them bad grades. I could, give them detentions. I could, call their parents. I could send them to off. There was always this distance, right? But now it's just like
you're working with them, not against them.
Right. Like you don't have to do anything that I say, right? So instead of a taskmaster or, just sort of this different, I mean, I have an authority here just because, of the relationship, but it's not like a legal or arbitrary kind of authority. And so, we're all on the same team, right? Like I want what you want, right? Like you want to do this? Yeah, let's do it. Like I help you any way I can, right? And I don't have to own that, right? I don't have to, I can let kids, and their families drive the bus and just be, the biggest cheerleader and coach and mentor on the bus, but I don't have to be, the one sort of directing it.
Yeah.
It's a huge difference for people.
Now, some people might have the idea that this is only for rich people, to do because it's running kind of like a private school would where that you have tuition from your students. How does that happen for maybe families that are a little more low income?
Sure. So when we started, Princeton Learning Cooperative, we were very intentional about wanting it to be an economically diverse community and for, being as accessible as possible to everybody. And so, we don't get any federal or, state money to do this. And so most of what we bring in to, pay the bills is from membership fees. But we offer fee reductions, to families who, just that the fees that we charge are just not, possible in any way. And so we have, families who can support us financially at the full level. We have families that we work with who are on pretty serious fee reductions. And so, I'm pretty proud to say we've never really turned anyone away for financial reasons. We do some fundraising, try to offset it, any kind of fee reductions. And, so it's worked out pretty well. They have a fairly diverse, sort of economic background. Well, it's hard too. I mean, we have one of our Liberated Learners centers up in like upstate New York, very kind of rural, very, low population density, very, economically distressed area. There's no real good way about it, right? So, we didn't really get into the sort of nuts and bolts of like the financing and all that kind of stuff of these centers, but it's a mix of, membership fees, grants, and fundraising, right? So, in that area, there's very little money that parents have that they can put towards, membership fees. And so, in those situations, that's where, looking for grants to do the funding, being very focused on, fundraising and things like that is probably the better strategy. So it just depends on the geographic area and the, median income and, all that kind of stuff. I'm sure probably just some, attitudes towards private education as well. Like on the East Coast in Princeton, everyone's like, they don't think twice about paying for education on top of their, public school taxes. But in some areas, it's just not, where I'm from in Ohio, it's just not, it's hard. Like not many people do it.
Well, and let's kind of talk about maybe some obstacles that you face. I mean, you're like the breadwinner. I mean, your wife is working, but, I can't imagine it being, and the book obviously talks about a lot of that. This was not an easy thing to do, to create a job for yourself type of thing. But so let's kind of go through some of those obstacles of what you faced and then maybe what you learned from those struggles.
Yeah, well, I will say that, there's no way in the world that I could have done what I did without my wife, Carrie. She's wonderful. Maybe she'll listen to this and I'll say a nice thing there. Right. So yeah, it was hard. There was never a sense that I was like fundamentally destroying our lives by doing this. Right. So, when I left my teaching job, she was still, a public school teacher outside of Philadelphia, which means good salary, pretty much covered health benefits, a pension, very little chance of being laid off or, so so that sort of stability was really key to jumping off and doing this. We couldn't have done it.
But you did have some members that maybe didn't have the safety net, correct? Is that?
Yeah. And so, I'm not saying minimizing the difficulty of it and the risk, but yeah, so there was always that behind it. But yeah, so there was, when I left or was talking about leaving, pretty much everybody I talked to thought it was just crazy, right? Because I was working in that same district where my wife worked, and it's like hitting the teacher lottery. It's, for every open position they have, there's like 100 applicants, right? And so, to walk away from that because the salary schedule at the district I was at tops out at over $100,000 a year, benefits and all this stuff. I mean, it's summers, get a couple months off to do stuff. I mean, so walking away from that to a lot of people was just, they didn't understand. It was just like, that's crazy. Like, why would you do that? And there was like zero guarantee that this would work, right? Or make any money. And so, what really, I think, tipped it for me was just how kind of miserable I had become kind of working in that system. So, the idea of quitting my job and, loss of salary and all that kind of stuff was definitely scary, but it was just absolutely horrifying to think that, this is going to be my life for the next 25, 30 years until I retire. I just couldn't, that was, I don't know, that was much more scary.
Talk about some of the challenges of getting it, the funding. I mean, that must have been a huge obstacle just in of itself of trying to, employ the salaries or employ the teachers that you needed and to make that work. How did you do that?
Yeah, so it was all bootstrapping, as they say in the entrepreneurial world. So the person who took the biggest sort of risk here was Paul Scutt, who is the other co-founder of PLC. And so he left before I did. I was still teaching full time, and he was the first staff member of that first deep pilot program year that we had. So I think we started PLC with like $4,000 in loans from kind of the 4 founding board members, and then just kind of build it as we went. And so, that was enough to like 1 month's rent on the on the space and insurance. And we had a handful of members. I think we started with 5, teens that we were working with, who could pay some, membership fees. And, times were lean. We basically funded it through just non-payment of salaries until we could build the program to the point where it could start to sustain, relatively decent salaries. That process of doing that, it was some of the most memorable and meaningful times of my life. It was such a change, because when I was teaching, whether I did a good job or bad job, it would have taken some really serious things for me to be let go, or not, and then all of a sudden the things I did and didn't do, trying to create this center, mattered immensely and directly, right? Like I was much more in control of how things went. And so, learning how to take on that responsibility, it's kind of an entrepreneur thing, was just amazing. Learning just my own learning. I didn't, everyone involved with PLC had like zero small business background or business background at all. We were all educators. And so learning how to do all of that stuff, keeping books, how to run a nonprofit, board of trustees, like marketing, outreach, the legal side of things, the accounting side. It was just all these skills and all of these, just things that we had to learn to survive. And so we just dove into those things and just worked really hard.
Well, let's kind of talk about that, of how basically, your idea of writing this book, and then also ways that you help other people. I mean, you've helped some people actually start their own learning centers, correct?
Yes.
So,
yep.
Yeah. Let's kind of talk about that, of how you do that, and with the book, the inspiration that you have behind that.
Yeah. So just to back up for a second, so a little bit of the history. So when we were starting PLC, we knew about this place in Massachusetts called North Star, which is really the sort of flagship, the first center like us that existed. And they were started back in 1996. And so we had found out about them. We're like, yeah, we like that model. Let's do that. And so we were kind of the second center that was sort of created in the United States based on that model. And so Ken Danforth, who's the one of the co-founders and directors up there, he was just really instrumental, and everyone at North Star, in helping us get started. So like just figuring out what we were doing and all the systems and all that kind of stuff. And so, just like I said, there's a lot of young people who are pretty miserable in school. There's a lot of teachers, right, who are miserable in school. And North Star would get a lot of emails and calls from people like, oh my God, like I love what you do. I want to do that. How can I do it? Right. I was one of them. Right. I sent this desperate email to Ken when I found out about North Star, like, help me, I want to do this. I'm stuck in school. Like, help me get out. And so he helped us. And so there was enough of those kind of inquiries that, and I became very good friends with Ken, and, still friends to this day. And we work together very closely. I was always like, Ken, we should have another organization that is dedicated solely to helping educators create places like this, right? Because he was just doing it through his North Star work. So he was like working with kids and doing, all the stuff that he did there. We were like, we should just have an organization that just does this. And so that was really the the idea behind what became known as Liberated Learners, which is the organization that helps people start these centers. And so that was the idea. And I think Liberated Learners has either 12 or 13 centers now open throughout the country and in Canada that's using this sort of model, right? And so part of my work, so I'm on the board at Liberated Learners, is to help adults create programs like this in their community. And the goal there, what our sort of vision is that this way of learning is not necessarily for everybody, but it should at least be an option to every young person, every community in the country, right? Yeah. So there needs to be like thousands of these places, right?
There really does. Yeah.
Right. And so that was the idea of Liberating Learners. And the idea for the book just came from, I think there's a book called The Magic of Thinking Big, which really is true, right? And so if you have your vision set big enough, right, like there should be thousands of these places, and you start thinking, well, how are we going to get there from here? We're at 2 or 3. How do we get to 4,000? Well, I can't have individual conversations with everybody, who wants to do this. It's just not enough time, right? So, how about something that can speak for us? So how about a book, that details, what this thing is that we're doing and talks about how to do it, what it entails, what the practicalities of it, but then also tells some stories of educators who have taken this path and created these things as hopefully inspiration to people. So the book really came from that. Just like there needs to be a place like this everywhere. There's miserable teachers and miserable kids, I guarantee, in every town in America. So let's put this out there, and hopefully it gets to the right people and they can start things. And we're there to help them.
Well, darn, we have talked for almost an hour. So I guess what I wanted to kind of close up with is maybe some frequently asked questions that you get from, parents and teachers and students, and, some final parting words of advice, and maybe how we can get a hold of this book.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Any frequently asked questions in particular? Anything? Or...
Well, what is the one question that you probably get the most? I mean, there's got to be something that someone asks you all the time, or people ask you all the time.
Yeah. Well, it's always, if my kid doesn't have a high school diploma, can they still be okay? So that's usually the big one. And for obvious reasons, right? Like, we're encouraging families to consider something that's, not too many people in the culture say, right? I mean, it's the dominant theme is stay in school. The only way you're going to have a successful life is to stay in school, right? If you don't go to school, if you don't graduate from high school in the traditional way, you're not going to get into a good college, and that means you're not going to get a good job, and you're just going to end up homeless and penniless and addicted to drugs, whatever it is, just this sort of slippery slope down from like, you don't go to high school, you're going to end up a bum or something. And, thankfully those aren't the only two options, right? So we talk to families a lot about that, how, if you don't go to high school, you don't, necessarily get a high school diploma, how do you move forward in life? So there's lots of ways. Should we talk about how you do that?
Yeah.
There's lots of ways, right? So, one is a homeschooler, the early homeschoolers have paved the way for this. There's millions of young people who don't go to school in the United States. Most of them end up going to college and doing things like that. And so every college admissions page that you go to usually has like a homeschooling application process, right? So it's not a big deal anymore if you don't go to high school. And what's shocking to a lot of people is that very often colleges, some of them do, but very often colleges don't require a high school diploma to attend there. For instance, Princeton University does not require a high school diploma to go there. Sometimes they might require some sort of certification from the state, but usually just like a GED test or some sort of equivalency test that you can take satisfies that, right? So you definitely don't need to attend high school. You might have to jump through a couple hoops, but it's possible. It's possible to move on without that. Some of our members will start getting involved at the community college at like 16, 17, 18. And one path to doing that is just to if you like that, just continue on. You can accumulate enough credits where, when you're at 18, 19, where you can just apply as a transfer student to a 4-year college. And they're just looking at your college record. They couldn't really care less what you did or didn't do in high school. SATs become irrelevant, to a large degree at that point. And so there's just always, there's all these different ways that you can take that just don't involve giving 4 years of your life to a traditional high school if you don't want to.
Yeah, that's very true. And there is hope for teachers, right? To have a place where they actually enjoy, their work that they love to do. So,
Yeah.
So give us just some parting words that you have for our listeners, and then your contact information of how they can get in touch with you.
So I guess I would just talk to teachers. If the reasons you went into education and working with young people, if you find that you're at odds with that on a daily basis, or if your sense of how to, correctly and properly support young people is at odds with what you do, and you want to try something different, like to really look into creating something like this. It's way easier than, say, going through the charter school process or starting a private school. Very little sort of overhead and permission that you need, and it's something that you can do. And so, like for me, especially what we talk with our young people, it's like, be the captain of your own ship. Have an idea of what you want out of your life, and then take the steps you need to make that a reality. And so if there's teachers out there who just feel stuck, there's another way. You don't have to be miserable every day. So I don't know, probably that's what I would say.
Great. And how can they get in touch with you so that maybe they can get some help or at least some ideas of how to get going?
So a lot of this is new. So there's a website now that you can come to. It's just Joel Hammon, Joel Hammon, HAMMON.com that you can go to. Set up a Facebook page. So it's just Joel J, which is my middle initial, Hammon at Facebook. At Twitter, it's Joel Hammon 2024. And then easiest thing really to get a hold of me is just by email. It's just me@joelhammon.com. The book is, available on Amazon and things like that. So.
Yeah. Well, and I really recommend getting Joel's book. Again, it's the Teacher Liberation Handbook. The subtitle is How to Leave School and Create a Place Where You and Young People Can Thrive. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not even a teacher, and it was just extremely hopeful to me and extremely exciting. I was rooting for Joel the whole time, knowing that he was going to be a huge help to young people around the world. Again, Joel's contact information is joelhammon.com. However, we will be sure to link all that information that we've discussed today on our website as well. But thank you so much, Joel, for coming on and helping us light our minds on fire. I so appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Rebecca. It was great.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Joel Hammon and to get his book and resources, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list and get our new monthly newsletter. Then check out the Services tab to see how we can continue to assist you, our fire starters. Also, to help us continue production of illuminating content, go to the Sponsor tab at theluminousmind.net for more information on sponsorship and affiliate programs. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and now Instagram. Get our free audio content by subscribing on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. To help us grow, consider these easy ways. Tell your friends about us, leave us a review, share our content. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.